Hey chatters, today we're going to be going over another agentic open source coding tool called Roo Code, which you can see here on the left of my VS Code. It's an extension in VS Code. I'm going to show you how to download it, how we're going to use it, as well as the frameworks I have in place to fully leverage this. So let's get into it. If you haven't already, just make sure that you go to the extensions in VS Code, and we're just going to look up Roo Code. I obviously already have it downloaded, but you'll just come here, you'll download it, and then you should see this little kangaroo icon show up on your sidebar right here. As far as agentic coding tools goes, this is probably the most comprehensive, and that kind of means the most expert level. There is just so much you can do with Roo Code that it's almost overwhelming. So I'm going to slowly take you through how to set this thing up, as well as some of the fun tools, and then we'll actually get to using it to code something in a code base I've already created. So the first thing we're going to want to do is set up our API keys. So you see this little gear icon, we're going to click that, and already I'm overwhelmed with all the stuff we can do. So the first is you can create different profiles, which pretty much just means it's easier to switch between your models that you want to use and the settings you have for them. So for right now, I have a default one, but I also have all these other specific profiles for different models. And you can just add a new profile by clicking that, or edit the existing one by clicking that, or deleting it. Like all these other things, you're just going to pick your provider. They have a bajillion to choose from, but we're just going to go with Open Router. You're going to go grab your key for whatever provider you chose. You can click this on, choose your model. It's going to tell you how much things cost and what it can do. Blah, 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 blah. You can enable reasoning. This is an important one, the enable editing through diffs. Make sure this is on, and I kind of range somewhere between 90 and 95%. The idea here is when it needs to edit something in your code base, right? It has to do a search and replace. So it's going to find that block of text it needs to replace, and then the block of text it said it's going to replace it with, and do the dirty, switch it up. The problem is if you do 100%, sometimes it makes like a little mistake or the formatting's off, and so it doesn't work. And so I recommend messing around, keeping this a little lower to make sure that it's actually doing the diffs and making the changes correctly. And then you can set your temperature and the rate limit. You're probably not going to touch that too much. So this is the bare minimum you need to get started. I didn't actually make any changes. So you can get started right now, and you'll see here, like I said, we have our default setup to talk to. We're not going to start yet. There's more settings I wanted to go through, but just to get started, that's all you have to do. Okay, back in settings, let's go through the rest of these. So the next is auto approve. This one is just so you've probably used a tool before and it stops everything and says, is it okay to move forward with this task? That's all this is. So you can just give it permission where you don't have to be the one to click yes. I would recommend maybe not doing a lot of these if you're first starting off. Maybe these 3, read, write, and retry, just to get yourself started. And then when you're more comfortable, and we'll go through some of the advanced stuff, you can click these on, but it's really up to you. And then you can do these other things. This is around if there's files outside the workspace you wanted to be able to change or do things with. And then this one's really important, the allowed auto execute commands. So even if you have this execute thing clicked on, it will come preloaded with a few different commands it can do. I've added more that I'm okay with it doing. Again, if you're just starting out, you don't know what you're doing, don't touch this. Just go with whatever the default is. But the idea is that if it needs to run something in the terminal, let's say, for example, run some tests for you, maybe you don't want to have to give approval every time it's running a test, because that's not really going to change anything. So you do npm test or PyTest. And that way you don't have to be like, okay, yes, you're allowed to run tests every single time. It'll just run the tests. So you just enter the prefix command that you want to just allow every time, hit add, and it'll get included in here. Next up is web browser. I'm actually going to turn this off. I feel like I turn it off every time and somehow it gets turned back on. It's not very good. I wouldn't recommend it, but sure, you can try it out if you want. This just allows it to open up a browser and click around on websites. Checkpoints, we'll go over this in a minute, but make sure this is turned on. This just allows you to very easily roll back the code changes. So if it goes off the rails at some point, you can just click a button and it'll essentially refresh the exact state it was in before it went off the rails. Notifications, you can read these if you want to put them on, sure. Context, you can probably just keep this the way it is. You might want to up the file read, auto truncate if you have really long files. But the idea here is if you have a bunch of tabs open, it's going to be able to read all of those files. And so how many tabs you want it to be allowed to read? How many file reads can it read all at once? So I would actually put this up to more 10 files or something like that. And then you can probably just leave the rest of it just the way it is as default. There is this context condensing. This is pretty new. The idea here is if you've ever used Claude Code, eventually you're going to hit that context window, right? 200,000 tokens, a million tokens, whatever it is, it's going to have way too much in its context. And that's going to not only mess things up because now it has to start cutting stuff from throughout the context. It might forget things, whatever it might be. So all this is going to do is summarize everything for you so that it can keep going without really losing all the context. So you might want to make your own little prompt in here if you want, but the idea here is it's pretty good just to help organize everything and summarize it so it can keep going and not lose track of what it was doing. Okay, terminal, you're probably not going to touch much in here. You can go through it if you want and mess around, but really you're going to be fine. You can just leave this the way it is. Okay, prompts. There's all these built-in default prompts if you want to change up again what they say. So for example, this is if you're prompting, it's going to automatically enhance your prompt. So this is the prompt that has to do that. So you probably don't need to touch this one, but if you want to mess around, if you're really nitty-gritty, you can make your own prompts. We have some experimental features. I would recommend turning on enable concurrent file edits for speed. This is just going to allow it to make a ton of edits at one time instead of having to do file by file. Power steering mode. So this is just to make it so it doesn't get off track. And then I'm not going to turn this on, but they do have code base indexing. This pretty much just embeds your entire code base using certain embedding models so that it can do retrieval augmented generation on your code base. So it doesn't necessarily have to read a whole file, or it's just easier for it to find what it needs to find. Language, and then just the about. You can import or export all your settings, whatever it might be. So already there's a lot there, right? So let's save. We're going to hit done, and then we're going to come to our interface. Okay, so before we do that, we got a couple more things we got to go through. The first is that there's this button right here, MCP servers. So this is where you can add any MCP servers that you can find. You can either do it by project or global. You'll see here, and we'll see if it works. We have Context 7 here. Context 7 is an MCP that keeps really up-to-date documentation on various APIs and programming. So it just makes it easier so you don't have to go search the web or scrape anything or use Perplexity or whatever. It can just go out and find the most up-to-date docs. So I'd highly recommend adding this one. You can find it just by Googling Context 7 Roo Code. It's right on their GitHub page, Context 7's to add it in. And you can see it's green. That means it's working. We'll see if it actually works, but you can add any and all MCPs. If we bring it up, it's just if you've ever done a config for MCPs before, it's the same thing. And then last but not least is our agents. We're going to be talking about boomerang mode in a second, but you can actually create specific agents who are specialists in specific things. So I created something called the PACT Framework for coding. It's prepare, architecture, code, and test. And so I have a variety of different specific prompts that follow the PACT architecture. So we have an orchestrator, which we'll show off in a minute. The preparer does all the research, finds all the documentation, comes up with a plan. The architect who actually says, okay, how are we going to implement this plan? And then specific coders for backend, frontend, and database. And then last but not least, our tester. And you'll see here, we have like specific prompts for each of them. We can add when to use, and then the available tools. This is probably the most important one. So what can this do? So you can give access, for example, I don't want this one, the orchestrator, to actually edit files. I just want it to be able to read files because it's supposed to be handing off tasks to other agents. All of this is actually can be controlled from this button right here, edit modes. And again, you can do either project modes or global. I have these as global. And you can see all they are just some JSON and or YAML. So we have our custom modes, the slug, so you know what it's called to call on. the name of it, the definition, and then the custom instructions, which translates to everything you see here. You can easily Google or use some web-enabled LLM to come up with your own. I will post this as well so that you can actually see how this is set up and you can use it yourself. But the general idea is you can create little specific agents that do specific things, have access to specific knowledge or tools, whatever it might be. Okay, so what makes Roo Code so special? It is really the subtasks as well as the ability to read a lot and make a lot of edits at the same time. So this code base I'm in, which is open source and I highly recommend you check out, is called the LLM Adapter Kit. This is a TypeScript skeleton so that you can very easily plug in any LLM to whatever application you're creating. Now, I don't have all the LLMs yet. For example, I have not put Grok in here yet. So as a test, what I'm going to do is we're going to start with our PACT orchestrator. I'm going to tell it to add Grok, and we're going to see what it does and how it does it. So I'm going to click enter. So I'm pretty sure Claude 4 Sonnet for this. You can see here, it's just like talking to itself essentially. It's coming up with a project plan, and you can see it's phasing out the work. First thing it does, subtask instructions. So right now what it's doing is it's using a subtask tool. It writes instructions and then sends that off to our PACT preparer. You can see here, it changed the model that it's using and it's a new chat. It's given it these instructions up here, much nicer than I would have done. And it's now going to go through and come up with a plan based on the existing code and system patterns. And then hopefully it will go out and find the Grok API information so that it actually has that and then add it in to the architecture. So you can see here, this is perfect. It's using context 7, which I was talking about, to go find the actual documentation. So I'm going to approve this and we're going to let it run. Okay, so it finished doing its research. It's now finishing what it did. You can see it's green now. It's coming up with some of the information that it wants to now pass on back to the orchestrator, who will then move on to the next phase, the architecture phase. Okay, subtask complete. So all that green stuff it just wrote out, it has now sent back to the PACT orchestrator. As you can see, PACT orchestrator says, okay, cool. We got phase 1 complete, our prepare phase. Now we're moving on to phase 2. So it's writing the instructions to the PACT architect, and now it's going to pass it on to there to write up all of the architecture documents to follow. So you can see now it's completing the architecture based on what we gave it. I'll take a second to type everything up, and then we'll be back to the orchestrator. We'll then hand it off to the coder to actually start implementing this. So you see here, it actually kind of screwed up. It didn't pass it back to the orchestrator. This is a complex thing. It doesn't always work. So when it breaks down, we can just go to new task, and you'll see it just brought me back to the orchestrator where it subtasked out. So I just copied what it said, and I'm just going to say, this is from the architect. And just make sure you're actually changing back to the orchestrator. It's going to stick with the last model you did. So let's send this off to the orchestrator again, so it has what it needs. And again, should hand it off to the coding agent. We can see here it's doing to the correct one. It sent it to our backend coder. This is all backend stuff. So as in all these things, it's going to start to read everything it needs to read, and then it will start to execute on it. So we should start to see it editing code files in just a few seconds. So right now it's creating our Grok models file. So each provider has a models file, which just you can see has this data structure of the provider, the name of the model, the actual API name we're sending it off to, context window, max tokens, the costs, and its capabilities for every model that we put in there for that provider. So we have a consistent data structure to call on. Now, I do want to point out there's probably going to be some mistakes in here. Like I'm seeing some models in here I'm not sure actually exist in Grok, and that's totally fine. And you always have to be wary of these tools. It's going to go off, it's going to hallucinate, it's going to be overly ambitious. So again, this one especially, because it really can automate the entire process. You got to be careful, especially if you're worried about cost. The great thing about the subtasking is that it actually keeps your costs really low. because you're not getting that super long conversation anymore that's going to drive up that cost, because the orchestrator is breaking it down. And when that sub agent finishes its task, it comes back to the orchestrator and then it sends it off for a new conversation. So you don't really get those higher max tokens that you're looking at, those longer conversations, which are going to drive up your cost, but it still adds up. So you got to be careful. You got to watch this thing and kind of understand what it's doing. If it's screwing up, always feel free to hit that cancel button and tell it that it's doing it wrong, or provide it with the right information to make sure it stays on track. Yeah, so right here, I'm actually noticing a mistake. It's creating this specific index for Grok. There are no other indexes for anything else. So I'm just going to say, keep doing what you're doing, but the Grok index file does not follow the existing system patterns. No other provider has an index. And we don't really need an index file, because the point is we have an actual index file that is going to roll up all the adapters, right? But we don't have like multiple things we need to index inside of Grok. This is good. It's asking me to run a command to remove something, so we're going to run that, and it should get rid of that file. We'll go back in, and you can see not there anymore. So we'll let it keep going. But this is what I mean. You got to pay attention to those things. It's going to want to do more than you asked it. It's going to go a little wild. So, you can leave it, but at your own risk. So you can see here we had an unsuccessful edit. This is what I was talking about earlier with the diffs, right? And I have it at 92% instead of 100%. So even then, it's not going to get it every time. But it just went and it corrected itself, and it made it work this time. Okay, and last but not least, it's making the test suite. This is normally probably something we want the test impact, the test agent to do, but it's also fine because the test agent's really about doing the actual testing and then iterating on the files to make sure everything's working. So it doesn't really matter whether or not the backend coder or the tester actually creates the tests, but hopefully after it creates this and kind of wraps things up, it'll go back to the orchestrator and send it off to the tester, so that we should be pretty all good, all set to start testing. You can see here it found some errors in what it wrote. I didn't have to say anything. It found the errors, and you can see it just fixed them. Okay, so the test isn't going to work. It is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. We're actually going to cancel, and I'm going to say, testing is not your job. Your task is complete. Use your complete tool. So in order for it to pass it back to the orchestrator, what triggers that is that it has to use the completion tool, which is exactly this when it shows up in green. So again, it was trying to do the testing. Things aren't set up for testing. I haven't installed the packages. I haven't set up the API. So we're going to send this back to the orchestrator, who will probably stop at this point. I won't actually waste time testing it. But you get the idea. Is now it's going to hand this off to the tester to actually make sure that this works. And I had to do very little in and amongst all of this stuff, right? I just said, let's add Grok, and it did pretty much everything with a couple nudges here and there to get to where we wanted it to be. So this is just an incredible tool, but also with great power comes great responsibility. This is not one I would necessarily use if you are super new to coding or vibe coding, for a couple different reasons. One, it's a bitch to set up, right? And to get it the way that you want to get it. The second is that it gives you all this control and ability, but if you don't know that it's going off the rails, you're going to waste a lot of time, energy, and maybe money trying to figure out what went wrong and when and how, because you don't really know what it did. So obviously there's ways around this: better prompting, making sure it's looking stuff up, having this test phase be super robust so that when it does make mistakes, it can test against those mistakes and iteratively and recursively improve itself. But none of that is any sort of replacement for still having your idea, a general understanding of the code base you're trying to create or edit or refactor or whatever, and just general principles that it should follow. So that's it for Roo Code. Definitely one of the more powerful agentic coding tools, and it's great again because it is open source. You got to use your own API key, but as I said, it can keep costs down and it can do a ton of stuff where you can be pretty hands off. So thanks for listening, chatters, and have some fun with Roo.